close your eyes for a moment and picture a world very different from the one we know today. A world where the maps were unfinished, where distant lands faded into mystery, where every mountain range seemed to hide another kingdom, another people, another story waiting to be discovered. The Mediterranean was the center of civilization for those who lived around it. Yet beyond its familiar shores stretched vast regions that most people knew only through travelers' tales, merchant stories, and legends passed from one generation to the next. Great empires had risen and fallen before, but one empire stood above them all. It stretched across mountains, deserts, fertile valleys, and ancient rivers. It ruled over countless nations, spoke dozens of languages, collected unimaginable wealth, and commanded armies so enormous that those who described them often struggled to find numbers large enough. To many people living in the 4th century before the Common Era, the Persian Empire did not simply appear powerful. It appeared permanent. Yet history has a habit of changing when very few people expect it. Sometimes those changes arrive through inventions, sometimes through ideas, sometimes through disasters, and sometimes they arrive in the form of one determined individual whose ambition refuses to recognize the limits that everyone else accepts. That individual was born in a kingdom that many of the sophisticated Greeks considered uncivilized. If an Athenian philosopher had been asked to point toward the place where the next ruler of the known world would emerge, Macedonia would have been among the last places he would have chosen. To many southern Greeks, Macedonia was distant, rough, and unsophisticated. Its nobles preferred hunting to debating philosophy. Its kings ruled through strength instead of democracy. Its people valued courage, loyalty, endurance, and martial skill far more than elegant speeches or theatrical performances. While Athens celebrated poets and philosophers, Macedonia celebrated warriors. Yet history often begins far away from the places that believe themselves to be the center of civilization. The kingdom of Macedonia occupied the northern edge of the Greek world. Dense forests covered much of its landscape. Mountains divided regions into isolated valleys. Rich plains provided excellent pasture for horses. Rivers carved their way toward the sea. Winters could be harsh. Summers could be brutally hot. Survival demanded resilience, and resilience shaped the character of the people who lived there. The Macedonian kings belonged to the Argead dynasty, a royal family that claimed descent from Heracles, the legendary hero whom later generations would know as Hercules. Whether that claim reflected historical truth or political mythology hardly mattered. Royal families throughout the ancient world traced their ancestry to divine or heroic figures because legitimacy depended not only upon power, but upon belief. A king ruled more easily when people believed the gods themselves had blessed his bloodline. The Greeks often argued about whether Macedonians were truly Greek. They spoke a form of Greek, worshipped Greek gods, participated in Greek religious traditions, and traced their ancestry to Greek heroes. Yet their customs seemed rougher, their accents unfamiliar, and their political system more monarchical than the fiercely independent city-states farther south. These distinctions created centuries of tension. Athens looked down upon Macedonia. Sparta underestimated Macedonia. Few realized that this northern kingdom was quietly becoming something entirely new. When Philip II became king in 359 BC, Macedonia faced disaster from almost every direction. Enemies surrounded the kingdom. The Illyrians threatened from the west. The Paeonians raided from the north. The Thracians remained dangerous neighbors. Greek cities challenged Macedonian influence along the coast. Internal rivals questioned Philip's right to rule. Many kingdoms had collapsed under less pressure. Philip refused to allow his kingdom to become another forgotten casualty of history. His youth had prepared him in unusual ways. Years earlier, while still a prince, Philip had lived in the Greek city of Thebes as a political hostage. Although the word hostage sounds grim to modern ears, noble hostages in the ancient world often received excellent educations. Their presence guaranteed political agreements between states, but also exposed them to foreign ideas. Philip watched carefully. Thebes possessed one of the finest military systems in Greece. Its commanders experimented with tactics that challenged traditional methods of warfare. Most rulers saw only battles. Philip studied systems. He examined organization, training, discipline, logistics, command structures. He observed how experienced generals coordinated different types of soldiers instead of relying upon a single formation. He learned quietly, patiently. Years later, those lessons would transform Macedonia forever. Returning home, Philip inherited a kingdom that many expected to fail. Instead, he began rebuilding every part of it. He reorganized the army from the ground up. Traditional Greek warfare centered around hoplites, carrying heavy shields and relatively short spears. Philip imagined something different. His infantry would carry the sarissa. The sarissa was no ordinary spear. It stretched roughly 18 feet in length. Holding such a weapon demanded two hands, making the large traditional shield impossible. Instead, Macedonian soldiers carried smaller shields strapped to the arm while gripping the enormous pike with both hands. When thousands of these soldiers stood together in disciplined ranks, the front of the formation became a living wall of spear points extending outward in multiple deadly rows. An enemy attempting to attack head-on faced not one spear, but several. Even reaching the first line often proved impossible. Yet Philip understood that no formation was perfect. The phalanx excelled on level ground. It struggled in rough terrain. Its long pikes made rapid maneuvering difficult. Instead of pretending these weaknesses did not exist, Philip designed an army where different units compensated for one another. Elite cavalry became the striking force. These horsemen, known as the companion cavalry, were drawn largely from Macedonia's noble families. Unlike cavalry that merely harassed enemies from a distance, the companions charged directly into battle. Their role was decisive. While the phalanx fixed the enemy in place, the cavalry would attack vulnerable flanks, creating panic and collapse. Light infantry screened the advance. Archi-weekend opposing formation. Engineers built siege machines. Supply officers organized provisions. Scouts gathered intelligence. The army became a coordinated machine rather than a collection of separate groups. This approach seems obvious today because modern armies rely upon cooperation between different branches. In Philip's era, it represented revolutionary thinking. Training became relentless. Soldiers drilled repeatedly. Discipline tightened. Officers learned to maneuver entire formations with remarkable precision. Marches became faster. Communication improved. Every campaign refined the system further. Philip also understood something equally important. An army marches on more than courage. It marches on food, money, equipment, animals, roads, organization. He expanded Macedonia's mining operations, especially its silver mines, generating enormous revenue. That wealth paid professional soldiers instead of relying solely upon temporary citizen levies. Professional soldiers trained constantly. Their effectiveness increased dramatically. Diplomacy became another weapon. Philip used marriage as carefully as military campaigns. Over his lifetime, he married multiple women from influential families across neighboring regions. Each marriage strengthened an alliance or neutralized a potential enemy. He bribed rivals when bribery proved cheaper than war. He negotiated when negotiation offered greater rewards than battle. When necessary, he fought. His famous saying captured this practical approach. No fortress is so strong that a mule loaded with gold cannot enter. Whether he actually spoke those exact words remains uncertain. The sentiment, however, accurately reflected his methods. Step by step, Macedonia expanded. Neighboring territories fell under Philip's influence. Hostile tribes were subdued. Strategic cities changed hands. Southern Greece watched uneasily. Many Greek states remained too busy competing with one another to recognize the larger danger developing beyond their northern frontier. Athens and Sparta had spent generations exhausting themselves through rivalry. The Peloponnesian War had shattered the balance of power. City fought city. Alliance opposed alliance. Victories proved temporary. Losses accumulated. Philip observed patiently while others weakened themselves. Eventually, confrontation became unavoidable. In 338 BCE, the decisive Battle of Chaeronea changed Greek history. Facing a coalition led by Athens and Thebes, Philip commanded the Macedonian army. Beside him rode his 18-year-old son. That young prince already possessed remarkable confidence. During the battle, Philip deliberately withdrew part of his line. The Athenians believed they were winning. They pursued aggressively. Their formation stretched. Order weakened. At precisely the right moment, Philip counterattacked. Meanwhile, the young prince led the companion cavalry against the elite Sacred Band of Thebes. The Sacred Band ranked among Greece's most respected military units. They had never expected defeat from an inexperienced teenager. History remembers that charge. Alexander broke through. The Theban line collapsed. The coalition army disintegrated. The victory placed Greece under Macedonian dominance. Philip did not destroy the Greek city-states. Instead, he organized them into what became known as the League of Corinth. Officially, the member states remained autonomous. In practice, Macedonia directed policy. One enormous goal now stood before Philip. Persia. For generations, Greeks had remembered the invasions launched by Persian kings. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. Those conflicts still echoed through Greek memory. Philip declared that Greece would finally carry the war into Asia. The invasion was presented not merely as conquest, but as revenge. Preparations began. Troops assembled. Supplies accumulated. Plans developed. History appeared ready to enter a new chapter under Philip's leadership. Yet another story had already begun within the royal palace. Years earlier, Philip had married Olympias, princess of Epirus. She possessed extraordinary intelligence, fierce determination, and a reputation that ancient writers described with equal parts admiration and fear. Later traditions surrounded her with stories of snakes, mysterious religious rites, prophetic dreams, and divine visions. Separating truth from legend remains difficult, because ancient authors often preferred dramatic storytelling over careful documentation. What seems clear is that Olympias possessed immense ambition. She believed her son had been born for greatness. Alexander entered the world in 356 BCE in the Macedonian capital of Pella. Ancient historians loved attaching miraculous events to famous births. One tradition claimed that the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, among the seven wonders of the ancient world, burned on the very night Alexander was born. According to later storytellers, the goddess herself had been absent because she attended the birth of the future conqueror. Another tradition claimed Olympias dreamed that lightning struck her womb. Another suggested Philip dreamed of sealing her womb with the image of a lion. These stories almost certainly emerged after Alexander's later victories. Ancient cultures often reshaped the past to make greatness appear inevitable. Real history is usually less dramatic. Yet even without miracles, Alexander's childhood proved extraordinary. He grew up in a royal court where politics remained dangerous. Victory brought power. Power created rivals. Rivals plotted. Loyalty shifted constantly. Young princes learned early that kingship offered privilege but never safety. Education reflected these realities. Alexander learned reading and literature, music, poetry, religion, medicine, mathematics, hunting, horseback riding, weapons training, physical endurance, discipline. His early tutor Leonidas emphasized toughness rather than comfort. Luxury weakened character. Hardship strengthened it. Meals remained simple. Exercises demanding. Young Alexander learned to tolerate hunger, fatigue, cold, and discomfort. Those lessons later allowed him to march farther than almost any commander in history. Another tutor introduced him to the poetry of Homer. Among all literary works, none captured Alexander's imagination more completely than the Iliad. The story of Achilles fascinated him. Achilles represented courage, honor, fame, glory purchased through personal sacrifice. Alexander reportedly kept a treasured copy of the Iliad with him throughout many campaigns. He did not merely admire Achilles. He wanted to equal him, perhaps even surpass him. This desire would shape countless decisions throughout his life. One famous childhood story became legendary. A magnificent horse had been brought before King Philip. The animal was enormous, powerful, and completely uncontrollable. Every experienced rider failed. The horse kicked, reared, refused every command. Philip prepared to dismiss the traitor. Young Alexander stepped forward. He believed the horse could be tamed. The adults laughed. Alexander insisted. Watching carefully, he noticed something others had missed. The horse continually shied away from its own shadow. Instead of forcing obedience through violence, Alexander quietly turned the animal toward the sun. The frightening shadow disappeared behind it. The horse calmed. Speaking gently, Alexander mounted successfully. The crowd watched in astonishment. Ancient sources claim Philip embraced his son afterward and declared that Macedonia was too small for his ambitions. Whether those exact words were spoken remains uncertain. The story itself illustrates qualities Alexander genuinely displayed throughout life. Observation, confidence, patience, boldness, seeing possibilities invisible to others. When Alexander reached adolescence, Philip arranged perhaps the finest education available anywhere in the Greek world. The philosopher Aristotle became his teacher. Aristotle already ranked among the greatest intellectuals of antiquity. A student of Plato and eventually one of history's most influential thinkers, Aristotle possessed astonishing curiosity. He studied ethics, politics, logic, biology, astronomy, medicine, literature, natural science, virtually every field of knowledge available during his lifetime attracted his attention. Philip established a school at Mysa where Aristotle instructed Alexander alongside other young Macedonian nobles who would later become the king's closest companions. Lessons extended far beyond memorizing facts. Students debated ideas, examined nature, read poetry, discussed government, considered justice, explored philosophy, studied geography, learned medicine useful during campaigns, observed plants and animals, asked questions, sought explanations. Aristotle encouraged disciplined thinking. Alexander absorbed far more than military knowledge. His later curiosity about distant cultures, unfamiliar animals, strange plants, and foreign customs reflected this education. Throughout his campaigns, he often sent biological specimens back to Greece. He remained intellectually curious even while leading armies across continents. Yet teacher and student would eventually differ profoundly. Aristotle believed Greeks naturally superior to non-Greeks. Alexander increasingly rejected such rigid distinctions. Conquest exposed him to civilizations every bit as ancient and sophisticated as Greece. His views evolved. Years later, he attempted, with mixed success, to unite different peoples rather than permanently separate conquerors from conquered. Seeds of that vision may already have existed during these formative years. Life within the royal family remained complicated. Philip continued marrying for political reasons. Each new marriage altered court politics. Each new child created possible succession disputes. Alexander understood that princes who failed to secure the throne often met unhappy endings. His relationship with Philip blended admiration, competition, affection, and growing tension. The king expected excellence. Alexander demanded recognition. Each possessed immense ambition. Eventually, father and son became rivals in ways neither fully intended. Their conflict deepened after Philip married another Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra. Not the famous Egyptian queen of later centuries, but a different woman sharing the common Greek name. During the wedding celebrations, one of Cleopatra's relatives reportedly toasted the hope that Philip would soon produce a legitimate heir. The implication was unmistakable. Alexander, whose mother came from Epirus, had just been publicly insulted. He exploded with anger. Harsh words followed. Philip, reportedly intoxicated, attempted to confront his son. Instead, he stumbled and fell before reaching him. Alexander looked at the assembled guests and mocked the king who intended to conquer Asia, yet could not successfully cross a banquet hall. The remark humiliated Philip. Father and son separated. Olympias returned temporarily to Epirus. Alexander also left court for a time. Although reconciliation eventually occurred, trust had been badly damaged. Meanwhile, Philip's preparations for invading Persia accelerated. The greatest military expedition in Greek history seemed only months away. No one realized fate had prepared a different commander for that campaign. At the grand wedding celebration of his daughter in 336 BCE, Philip entered the theater surrounded by celebration, confidence, and apparent security. Then one of his own bodyguards attacked. The king collapsed, mortally wounded. Panic spread instantly. The assassin attempted escape, but was killed almost immediately. His motives remain debated more than 2,000 years later. Some historians believe personal grievances motivated the attack. Others suspect political conspiracy. Questions have long surrounded Olympias. Some have wondered about Alexander himself. Others point toward Persian involvement. The surviving evidence cannot provide certainty. History often preserves outcomes more clearly than motives. Philip II, architect of Macedonian greatness, lay dead. His remarkable transformation of Macedonia had made future conquest possible. The army, the economy, the military reforms, the plan to invade Persia, all belonged originally to Philip's vision. Now everything depended upon a 20-year-old prince whose abilities remained largely untested as king. Within hours, the future of Macedonia rested upon Alexander's shoulders, and the entire ancient world was about to discover that Philip had not merely built a kingdom. He had unknowingly prepared the stage for one of history's most astonishing lives. The death of Philip created more than grief inside Macedonia. It created uncertainty. And in the ancient world, uncertainty could be deadlier than any invading army. A kingdom held together by the authority of one powerful ruler could begin to unravel almost overnight if that ruler disappeared. Allies reconsidered their loyalties. Rivals sensed opportunity. Ambitious nobles began calculating their own chances. Neighboring tribes watched carefully, waiting to see whether Macedonia would fracture from within before they struck from without. Alexander understood all of this immediately. He did not have the luxury of mourning his father. He had to become king before anyone else decided they might become king instead. The Macedonian army gathered quickly. Among these soldiers were veterans who had spent years campaigning under Philip. They had marched across mountains, fought experienced Greek armies, and helped transform Macedonia into the strongest military power in Europe. Their loyalty would determine whether Alexander ruled or disappeared into history as another prince who never reached the throne. Standing before them was a young man only 20 years old. To some he still seemed almost a boy, yet many had already seen him fight. At Corinthia, he had led cavalry against the sacred band of thieves. He had not hesitated. He had not hidden behind older commanders. He had charged where the fighting was fiercest. Those memories mattered now. The generals who had served Philip also understood something important. Changing kings in the middle of political crisis could destroy everything they had built. Stability offered the greatest chance of survival. Alexander secured their support with remarkable speed. The army proclaimed him king. That single decision changed history. Yet wearing the royal title did not make him safe. Macedonian politics could be ruthless. Royal blood often proved as dangerous as it was prestigious. Anyone with a plausible claim to the throne represented a potential center of rebellion. Ancient monarchies rarely tolerated rival claimants for long. Alexander moved decisively. Several possible rivals disappeared from the political stage almost immediately. Some were executed. Others died under circumstances that ancient historians describe differently depending upon which source one reads. His mother, Olympias, acted with particular ferocity against members of Philip's final household. Ancient writers record brutal acts of revenge that shocked even people living in an age accustomed to political violence. Whether Alexander approved every action remains uncertain. What is clear is that he did not reverse them. By the time the first weeks of his reign ended, no serious rival remained alive. To modern readers, these events can appear horrifying. To many contemporaries, they appeared predictable. Ancient kings who showed mercy toward rivals often paid with their own lives. Alexander learned one of the harshest lessons of monarchy almost immediately. Survival sometimes demanded decisions that would haunt a ruler forever. No sooner had internal threats been addressed than danger emerged beyond Macedonia's borders. News of Philip's assassination spread rapidly. Far to the south, Greek cities debated rebellion. Many believed Macedonian dominance would collapse now that the great king was gone. Athens listened eagerly to orators who insisted the young Alexander lacked his father's experience. Thebes prepared openly for resistance. Farther north, Illyrian and Thracian tribes also sensed weakness. They had fought Philip for years. Perhaps this inexperienced king would prove easier to defeat. The situation looked dangerous. Alexander answered with speed. Speed would become one of his greatest weapons throughout his career. Ancient armies usually moved slowly. Large numbers of men required food. Animals needed water. Roads remained poor. Commanders preferred caution. Alexander repeatedly ignored conventional expectations. He drove his forces forward with astonishing pace. His enemies often learned he was approaching only after he had already arrived. Marching south, Alexander appeared before rebellious Greek cities before they fully expected him. His arrival alone transformed the political situation. Many communities reconsidered resistance. Most submitted. Only one city chose another path. Thebes. Thebes possessed a proud military tradition. Only a generation earlier it had defeated Sparta, ending Spartan dominance in Greece. Its citizens believed they could resist Macedonia. Some expected Athens and other Greek states to join them. Others believed Persia might provide support. Alexander offered terms. He did not immediately attack. He allowed opportunities for surrender. The Thebans rejected them. They believed they still possessed a chance. The siege began. Despite determined resistance, Macedonian forces eventually broke into the city. What happened afterward became one of the most controversial decisions of Alexander's life. Thebes was destroyed. Its buildings were demolished. Thousands died during the fighting. Survivors were sold into slavery. Only temples and the house associated with the poet Pindar escaped destruction. The message spread across Greece with extraordinary speed. Resistance meant annihilation. Submission meant survival. Athens, shocked by Thebes' fate, abandoned thoughts of immediate revolt. Other cities quickly reaffirmed loyalty. Alexander had secured Greece through one devastating example. Modern historians continue debating whether this destruction was strategically necessary. Some argue it prevented years of rebellion while Alexander campaigned abroad. Others see it as excessive brutality. Both interpretations acknowledge the same fact. After Thebes, no major Greek uprising threatened Alexander during the remainder of his life. With southern Greece secured, Alexander turned north. The tribes beyond Macedonia still posed danger. If he invaded Persia while hostile peoples threatened his homeland, disaster could follow. Again, he moved rapidly. Campaigns across Thrace and toward the Danube demonstrated that the young king possessed not only courage, but exceptional adaptability. The terrain differed dramatically from the plains of Greece. Dense forests alternated with steep mountains. Rivers complicated movement. Local tribes preferred ambushes rather than open battle. Alexander adjusted his methods accordingly. One memorable incident became famous among ancient military writers. A Thracian force occupied high ground overlooking the Macedonian advance. At the summit, they had assembled wagons. Their plan was simple. Once the Macedonians climbed the slope, the defenders would release the wagons downhill. The heavy vehicles would smash through the advancing formations, creating panic and opening the way for a counterattack. Most commanders would have accepted severe losses. Alexander devised another solution. He instructed his soldiers that where the slope allowed, they should simply open their ranks and let the wagons pass harmlessly between them. Where there was no room to move aside, they should kneel and lock their shields overhead. The wagons thundered downhill. Some rushed harmlessly through empty gaps. Others bounced over the shield formations. The terrifying attack failed. Moments later, the Macedonians surged uphill. The defenders, shocked that their carefully prepared trap had accomplished almost nothing, broke and fled. Again, Alexander demonstrated a pattern that would define his career. He solved problems by thinking differently. Many victories resulted not merely from bravery, but from rapid observation and unconventional responses. By the end of these northern campaigns, Macedonia's frontiers were secure. The Greek cities remained quiet. The army trusted its young king completely. Now the great project inherited from Philip could finally begin. The invasion of Persia. To understand the scale of Alexander's ambition, it helps to appreciate what Persia represented. The Achaemenid Empire stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains of Central Asia. Its territory included modern Egypt, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, Armenia, Afghanistan, and regions beyond. It governed millions of people. It collected tribute from dozens of nations. Its royal roads connected distant provinces across thousands of miles. Its treasury contained unimaginable wealth. Persian kings commanded resources unlike anything Macedonia had ever possessed. Against such an empire, Alexander's own kingdom appeared tiny. Many observers assumed the campaign would end in disaster. Alexander himself understood the risks. Before crossing into Asia, he appointed Antipater as regent in Macedonia. With approximately 12,000 infantry and 1,500 cavalry, Antipater remained behind to govern Greece and defend the homeland. Alexander could not risk rebellion while campaigning abroad. The force accompanying him numbered roughly 48,000 infantry and around 6,000 cavalry. Compared with Persian manpower, this army seemed almost insignificant. Quality, however, mattered more than quantity. These soldiers had trained for years. They trusted one another. They understood Philip's tactical system perfectly. Many had campaigned together repeatedly. Their discipline far exceeded that of most armies they would encounter. During the spring of 334 BCE, the expedition reached the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. Crossing those waters held symbolic meaning beyond simple geography. Alexander deliberately transformed the moment into political theater. Ancient kings understood symbolism. Stories inspired armies. Ceremonies strengthened legitimacy. Alexander sacrificed to Poseidon while crossing. Upon reaching the Asian shore, he reportedly threw a spear into the ground, declaring the continent won by the spear. Whether every detail occurred exactly as later historians described remains uncertain. What matters is that Alexander wanted everyone watching to understand his intentions. He had not crossed merely to raid Persian territory. He intended to conquer it. Before advancing inland, he visited Troy. The ruined city already carried legendary status because of Homer's Iliad. Alexander walked among places associated with Achilles. He offered sacrifices. He honored heroes whose stories had shaped his childhood imagination. He reportedly exchanged his own armor for sacred weapons preserved within Athena's temple. Whether symbolic or practical, the gesture reinforced his self-image. He no longer viewed himself simply as Philip's son. He saw himself continuing the heroic tradition stretching back to the age of myth. Meanwhile, Persian authorities had begun organizing resistance. Regional governors known as satraps assembled forces in northwestern Asia Minor. Among their advisors stood Memnon of Rhodes, an experienced Greek mercenary commander serving Persia. Memnon recognized the danger Alexander represented. He proposed avoiding major battle altogether. Instead, Persian forces should withdraw deeper into Asia, destroy crops, remove supplies, force the Macedonians to march through empty countryside. Without food, Alexander's army would eventually weaken. Time would favor Persia. Strategically, it was excellent advice. The Persian satraps rejected it. Burning their own lands seemed dishonorable. Retreat appeared cowardly. Many believed the invaders could simply be crushed near the frontier. They selected defensive positions beside the Granicus River. The river itself was not enormous. Its banks, however, were steep. Crossing under enemy attack would prove difficult. Persian cavalry lined the opposite side. Behind them waited infantry, including experienced Greek mercenaries. Alexander reached the battlefield late in the day. Some senior commanders advised waiting until morning. Night approached. Visibility would decline. A fresh attack after sunrise seemed safer. Alexander disagreed. Delay offered Persia additional time. Surprise remained valuable. He decided to attack immediately. As always, he led personally, mounted upon his horse, surrounded by the companion cavalry. He entered the river first. Water splashed around charging horses. Men struggled against the current. The muddy banks slowed movement. Persian cavalry descended upon them. The first moments proved chaotic. Alexander fought in the thickest fighting. At one point, a Persian noble struck his helmet with tremendous force. The blow damaged the helmet and nearly killed him. Another Persian prepared to deliver the finishing strike. Before he could do so, Clitus the Black cut him down. The king survived by seconds. Such incidents became common throughout Alexander's campaigns. He repeatedly placed himself where danger was greatest. This inspired extraordinary loyalty. It also nearly ended his life many times. More Macedonian cavalry crossed behind the first wave. The pressure increased. Gradually, the Persian line began giving way. Once the cavalry formation lost cohesion, the battle shifted rapidly. The Macedonian advance gained momentum. Persian resistance collapsed. Many cavalry units fled. The Greek mercenaries remained. Unlike the cavalry, they continued fighting in disciplined formation. They requested terms. Alexander refused. From his perspective, these men had chosen to fight for Persia against fellow Greeks. He intended to discourage others from making the same choice. The phalanx surrounded them. Thousands died. Survivors were sent into forced labor. The Battle of the Granicus marked Alexander's first major victory against Persia. Its consequences reached far beyond the battlefield. Western Asia Minor suddenly lay exposed. Greek cities under Persian rule now faced a decision. Should they resist, or should they open their gates? Alexander moved quickly from city to city. Some welcomed him enthusiastically. Many Greek communities regarded Macedonians as fellow Greeks and viewed Persian authority with little affection. Others hesitated. A few resisted. Where cities surrendered peacefully, Alexander often respected local institutions. He removed Persian officials, restored certain democratic governments, reduced tribute, presented himself as liberator rather than conqueror. Political image mattered enormously. Every peaceful surrender saved lives. Every city captured without siege preserved supplies and momentum. Not every settlement accepted him willingly. Miletus resisted. Its harbor still offered Persia valuable naval opportunities. Alexander surrounded the city. His fleet blocked reinforcement by sea. Siege engines battered defenses. Eventually Miletus fell. Halicarnassus proved an even greater challenge. Strong walls, experienced defenders, powerful fortifications. Memnon organized resistance skillfully. The siege lasted for months. Massive towers rolled toward the walls. Battering rams pounded stone. Catapulture de missiles overhead. Defenders launched sorties to burn siege equipment. Fighting erupted not only atop walls, but beneath them as engineers dug tunnels and counter-tunnels. Although portions of Halicarnassus eventually fell, parts of the defending force escaped by sea. Even so, the campaign demonstrated another critical reality. Alexander possessed not only battlefield brilliance, he also commanded some of the finest siege engineers in the ancient world. Throughout history, many commanders excelled either in open battle or siege warfare. Few mastered both. Alexander increasingly appeared capable of handling almost every military challenge presented to him. As months passed, more territory acknowledged his authority. Supply lines lengthened. The army gained confidence. Victories accumulated. Each success strengthened Alexander's reputation among allies and frightened potential enemies. Stories spread ahead of him. Some exaggerated. Others invented miraculous details. Such stories hardly mattered. Fear itself became a weapon. By the close of the first campaigning season, Alexander controlled much of Western Asia Minor. The invasion had succeeded beyond expectations. Yet he had defeated only regional forces. The true ruler of Persia still remained far away. King Darius III had not yet personally entered the struggle. That would soon change. Far to the east, in the imperial capitals of the Persian Empire, reports arrived one after another. A young Macedonian king had crossed into Asia. Provincial armies had been defeated. Greek coastal cities continued changing sides. The situation could no longer be dismissed as another border disturbance. For Darius, this invasion had become an imperial crisis. Messengers rode across the empire. Troops gathered from distant provinces. Cavalry assembled from the Great Plains. Infantry marched from ancient cities. Archers, engineers, nobles, mercenaries. Entire satrapies prepared contingents. One of history's largest military machines slowly awakened. Alexander had won the opening moves. Now he would face the full attention of the greatest empire on earth. And neither he nor his soldiers could yet know that the battles waiting ahead would become some of the most famous military encounters in all of human history. As Alexander pushed farther into Asia Minor, the nature of the campaign began to change. During the first months of the invasion, he had mostly fought regional governors acting on behalf of the Persian king. Their defeats had opened Western Asia, but they had not broken the empire itself. Persia was still intact. Its administrative system continued functioning. Taxes continued flowing toward the royal treasury. Vast armies could still be assembled from provinces stretching thousands of miles across the continent. For Alexander, the next stage would be far more dangerous. Soon he would no longer face governors trying to defend their provinces. He would face the great king himself. Darius III had now accepted that the Macedonian invasion was no temporary raid. This was no ambitious prince seeking plunder before sailing home. Alexander intended to dismantle the Persian Empire completely. For a ruler whose ancestors had governed the largest empire on earth for more than 2 centuries, such an idea must have seemed almost absurd. From the Persian perspective, Macedonia remained a relatively small kingdom. Its army, however disciplined, appeared tiny beside the resources Persia could summon. Darius, therefore, began gathering an enormous force. Messengers traveled throughout the empire. Provincial governors assembled troops. Cavalry arrived from the eastern steppes. Archers came from distant satrapies. Greek mercenaries entered Persian service. Supplies filled massive storehouses. Roads carried endless columns of soldiers toward the king. Meanwhile, Alexander continued advancing along the southern coast of Asia Minor. He rarely rushed without purpose. Every city he secured strengthened his supply network. Every harbor removed another possible base for the Persian fleet. He understood that wars were won not only through dramatic victories, but through careful preparation. His route eventually brought him to Gordium. This ancient city possessed one of the most famous legends in the Greek world. Inside stood an old wagon tied to its yoke by an extraordinarily complicated knot. According to tradition, whoever untied that knot would become ruler of Asia. Many had tried. None had succeeded. Ancient sources disagree about what happened next. Some claim Alexander studied the knot before drawing his sword and slicing through it with a single blow. Others suggest he quietly removed the pin fastening the yoke, solving the puzzle without cutting the rope at all. Whichever version is closer to reality, the story endured because it reflected something genuine about Alexander's character. He refused to become trapped by conventional thinking. When others accepted impossible problems, he searched for unexpected solutions. The Gordian knot became a lasting symbol. Even today, people speak of cutting the Gordian knot when describing a bold solution to a seemingly impossible challenge. Leaving Gordium behind, Alexander marched southeast. The terrain became increasingly rugged. Mountain passes controlled movement between regions. Heat grew more intense. Supply lines stretched farther from the Aegean coast. Yet morale remained high. Victory after victory had convinced the Macedonians that their king possessed extraordinary fortune. Among the soldiers, stories spread that the gods favored him. Such beliefs mattered enormously in ancient warfare. Confidence often proved as valuable as weapons. During the campaign, Alexander fell seriously ill at Tarsus. Ancient writers describe him bathing in the cold waters of the Cydnus River after marching under intense heat. Soon afterward, he developed a dangerous fever. Whether the illness resulted from the cold water, an existing infection, malaria, or another disease remains uncertain. His condition became alarming. The army watched anxiously. Everything depended upon him. Without Alexander, the expedition might collapse. A physician named Philip of Acarnania prepared medicine for the king. At the same time, one of Alexander's officers reportedly delivered a letter warning that the physician had accepted Persian bribes to poison him. The situation became a remarkable test of trust. According to the traditional story, Alexander handed the warning letter to Philip while calmly drinking the medicine. As the physician read the accusation, the king swallowed the mixture without hesitation. If the story is accurate, it revealed absolute confidence in a trusted friend. Alexander recovered. The campaign continued. Not long afterward, dramatic news arrived. Darius had moved unexpectedly. Instead of waiting where Alexander anticipated, the Persian king had maneuvered through mountain passes and appeared behind the Macedonian army. His movement cut Alexander's communications. For a brief moment, it seemed the Persians had gained a strategic advantage. Yet geography soon altered everything. Darius had advanced into the narrow coastal plain near the town of Issus. The battlefield he occupied restricted movement between the mountains and the sea. The vast Persian army could not fully deploy. Its numerical superiority became far less useful. Alexander immediately recognized the opportunity. He turned his army around and marched back toward Darius with astonishing speed. Soon the two armies stood facing one another across the Panaris River. The contrast between the commanders could hardly have been greater. Darius commanded one of the wealthiest empires ever created. His army probably outnumbered Alexander significantly, though ancient historians often exaggerated military numbers beyond credibility. Alexander commanded fewer soldiers, but nearly every man in his army had trained together for years. Discipline remained exceptional. The Macedonian line formed carefully. The long pikes of the phalanx pointed forward in dense ranks. Light infantry screened the front. On the right stood the companion cavalry. At their head waited Alexander himself. As always, he would not observe from safety. He intended to fight where the danger proved greatest. Across the river, Darius occupied the center of his army. He rode in a magnificent royal chariot surrounded by elite guards. Persian cavalry held both wings. Greek mercenaries strengthened the infantry. Everything seemed prepared for a decisive confrontation. The battle began. The Macedonian infantry advanced through the river under heavy pressure. Water slowed movement. Steep banks disrupted formations. Fighting became confused. In the center, Greek mercenaries resisted fiercely. Elsewhere, Persian cavalry pushed aggressively against the Macedonian left. For a time, the outcome remained uncertain. Then Alexander made his move. Instead of driving straight ahead, he angled his cavalry toward the Persian left. This forced Darius to respond. Persian units shifted position. The movement created small openings within the line. Alexander watched carefully. The instant he recognized weakness, he changed direction. The companion cavalry wheeled sharply. Their charge now aimed directly toward the opening, toward Darius himself. It happened with astonishing speed. The heavy cavalry crashed through weakened formations. Persian guards struggled desperately to stop them. Dust filled the battlefield. The sound of metal striking metal echoed across the plain. Alexander drove relentlessly toward the royal chariot. From Darius's perspective, the danger became immediate. The Macedonian king had broken through. Elite cavalry were cutting down guards only a short distance away. If the great king fell or was captured, the battle would end instantly. Darius chose survival. He turned his chariot, then fled. In modern warfare, armies usually continue fighting even after commanders withdraw. Ancient battles operated differently. The king represented the heart of the army. His courage inspired confidence. His flight shattered it. News spread rapidly. The king has fled. Those words proved devastating. Persia morale collapsed. Units that had been fighting effectively suddenly broke apart. Some attempted organized retreat. Others simply ran. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Alexander had won. Again, the consequences reached beyond military victory. Darius abandoned not only the field, but also his royal camp. Within it remained extraordinary treasures: gold, silver, luxurious furnishings, royal records. Most significantly, members of the Persian royal family. Darius's mother, his wife, his daughters, his young son. For a conquering king, these captives represented enormous political value. Many ancient rulers would have treated them harshly. Alexander surprised both Greeks and Persians. He ordered that they receive royal treatment. No insult, no humiliation, no abuse. When the elderly queen mother mistakenly bowed before Hephaestion, believing the taller man must be Alexander, she realized her error and became terrified. Alexander reportedly smiled and replied that Hephaestion was also Alexander. Whether the conversation occurred exactly as later historians recorded cannot be proven. Yet multiple traditions agree on the essential point. Alexander treated the royal family with dignity. This generosity was not simply kindness. It demonstrated political intelligence. Persian nobles observing these events saw that the Macedonian king respected royal authority. He behaved less like a destroyer than like someone preparing to inherit the empire. Soon afterward, envoys arrived from Darius. The Persian king proposed peace. His offer appeared astonishingly generous. Alexander could keep all territory conquered so far. He would receive an immense ransom. He would marry into the Persian royal family. Everything west of the Euphrates River would become his. For many commanders, such terms would have represented overwhelming success. Parmenion, Alexander's experienced general, supposedly remarked, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander answered with words that became famous. "So would I, if I were Parmenion." The reply captured the difference between the two men. Parmenion thought like an accomplished general. Alexander thought like someone attempting to reshape history. He had not crossed into Asia merely to seize border provinces. He intended to replace Darius entirely. No compromise could satisfy that ambition. Rejecting peace, Alexander marched south. At first glance, this decision puzzled many observers. Darius remained alive. Why not pursue him immediately? Alexander considered broader strategy. The Persian navy still operated across the eastern Mediterranean. As long as Persian fleets retained secure ports, they could threaten Greece, raid supply lines, and encourage rebellion behind him. The solution lay not at sea, but on land. Capture every major harbor. Without ports, the fleet would eventually become powerless. One by one, the cities of Phoenicia faced difficult choices. Most surrendered. One did not. Tyre. Unlike ordinary coastal cities, Tyre stood upon an island approximately half a mile from shore. Its walls rose directly from the sea. Strong ships defended the approaches. The inhabitants believed themselves practically invincible. Alexander requested permission to enter peacefully and sacrifice at the temple of Melkart, a deity the Greeks associated with Heracles. The Tyrians refused. Alexander decided the city would fall. What followed became one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world. Rather than abandoning the siege, Alexander ordered construction of a massive causeway connecting the mainland to the island. Stone, earth, timber, everything available was thrown into the sea. Day after day, workers extended the structure farther across the water. Tyrian defenders attacked constantly. Archers showered missiles upon the laborers. Ships launched surprise assaults. Divers attempted sabotage beneath the waves. At one point, the defenders sent an old vessel packed with combustible material drifting toward the causeway. When it reached the siege works, they ignited it. Flames consumed towers and equipment. Months of effort disappeared within hours. Many commanders would have abandoned the project. Alexander rebuilt. Again and again. He gathered ships from recently surrendered Phoenician cities. Gradually, naval superiority shifted. Floating siege towers approached the walls. Battering rams struck stone. Catapults hammered defenders. After 7 exhausting months, a breach finally opened. Macedonian soldiers stormed into Tyre. The long siege had filled them with rage. Thousands of defenders died. Many survivors entered slavery. Ancient accounts estimate around 8,000 killed and perhaps 30,000 enslaved, though precise numbers remain impossible to verify. The destruction shocked the eastern Mediterranean. Every remaining city understood the lesson. Resistance could become catastrophically expensive. Continuing south, Alexander encountered another determined fortress. Gaza, built upon elevated ground and heavily fortified, it controlled important routes into Egypt. Again, siege engines advanced. Again, defenders resisted fiercely. Again, the city eventually fell after prolonged struggle. Only then did the road into Egypt finally open. The Persian governor recognized reality. Attempting resistance would only bring destruction. He surrendered peacefully. Alexander entered Egypt not as an enemy, but largely as a liberator. Egypt had endured Persian rule for generations. Many Egyptians viewed the Macedonian arrival as an opportunity rather than a disaster. Alexander respected local traditions. He offered sacrifices according to Egyptian custom. Priests crowned him pharaoh, instead of presenting himself solely as foreign conqueror. He adopted the ancient responsibilities of Egyptian kingship. This political flexibility distinguished him from many conquerors before and after. He understood that ruling required legitimacy as much as force. During his stay, he traveled to the western desert. After days crossing harsh landscapes, he reached the famous oracle at Siwa, dedicated to the god Ammonius, whom Greeks identified with Zeus. The sanctuary possessed enormous religious prestige. Exactly what occurred there remains one of history's enduring mysteries. The priests spoke privately with Alexander. No complete record survives. Later traditions claimed they hailed him as the son of Zeus. Others suggest misunderstandings of language contributed to the story. Whatever happened, the visit deeply influenced Alexander's public image. From that point onward, stories about his divine ancestry multiplied. Whether he genuinely believed them or simply recognized their political usefulness remains impossible to know. While still in Egypt, he made another decision whose importance would far outlast his own lifetime. Examining the Mediterranean coastline near the Nile Delta, Alexander selected the site for a new city. Its position offered remarkable advantages: a fine harbor, access to the Nile, connections to Mediterranean trade, routes into Africa and the Near East. Surveyors marked streets. Engineers prepared plans. The city received a simple name: Alexandria. Alexander founded many cities bearing his name throughout his campaigns. Most became regional settlements. This one became immortal. Over the following centuries, Alexandria would grow into one of the greatest cities on earth. Its famous library would collect hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. Its scholars would calculate the circumference of the earth, develop mathematics, study medicine, astronomy, literature, and philosophy. Merchants from every corner of the Mediterranean would crowd its harbors. Cultures would meet there as nowhere else in the ancient world. Without Alexander's decision on that Egyptian shoreline, much of later intellectual history would look very different. By the spring of 331 BCE, the campaign had entered an entirely new phase. Asia Minor belonged to Alexander. Phoenicia belonged to Alexander. Egypt belonged to Alexander. The Persian fleet had effectively lost its principal bases. Immense wealth flowed into Macedonian hands. His army stood experienced, confident, and fiercely loyal. Yet the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Darius remained alive. Far to the east, he gathered another army. Larger, stronger, drawn from the deepest resources of the empire. This time the battlefield would not be confined by narrow coastal plains. This time the Persian king intended to fight where his numbers could finally matter. Alexander left Egypt and marched northeast toward Mesopotamia. Ahead lay open country, wide plains, ground carefully chosen by Darius himself. Both rulers understood what approached. The next battle would determine far more than a campaign. It would decide the fate of an empire that had dominated the ancient world for over 200 years. And it would determine whether the young king from Macedonia truly possessed the ability to conquer the greatest empire humanity had yet seen. As Alexander marched out of Egypt and crossed once more into the lands of Mesopotamia, the campaign entered its defining stage. Every victory until now had been extraordinary, but none had yet delivered complete control over the Persian Empire. Darius still lived. He still wore the title of Great King. Across the eastern provinces, governors remained loyal to him. As long as he remained free, the empire possessed a ruler around whom resistance could gather. Alexander understood that another decisive battle was inevitable. So did Darius. Unlike Issus, where narrow terrain had restricted his army, Darius intended to fight on ground chosen specifically for Persian strengths. Near the village of Gaugamela, not far from modern Mosul in Iraq, he selected an immense plain where cavalry could maneuver freely and where every advantage seemed to belong to Persia. Ancient writers describe workers leveling parts of the battlefield before the armies arrived. Rocks were removed. Uneven ground was smoothed. The Persian king wanted nothing to interfere with the charge of his cavalry or the terrifying scythed chariots that would spearhead his attack. The preparations reflected confidence, perhaps even desperation. Darius had learned from his previous defeats. He would not again allow Alexander to force him into cramped terrain. This time he intended to overwhelm the Macedonians with sheer size. His army gathered from nearly every corner of the empire. Persian nobles arrived wearing brilliant armor. Horse archers came from the distant eastern plains. Indian contingents brought war elephants. Scythe chariots waited at the front of the line, their wheels fitted with razor-sharp blades designed to cut through infantry formations. Modern historians debate the total size of Darius's army. Ancient sources often claimed hundreds of thousands, even more than 1 million men. Such numbers almost certainly exaggerate reality. Even so, there is little doubt that Alexander faced a significantly larger force. The Macedonian army had changed little in size since leaving Europe. Its strength did not lie in overwhelming numbers. It lay in experience, discipline, leadership, and absolute confidence in the man commanding it. When Alexander approached the battlefield, several of his generals advised caution. Some suggested attacking at night. Darkness might reduce the Persian numerical advantage. Others believed delay could reveal weaknesses in the enemy position. Alexander rejected a night attack. According to ancient tradition, he declared that he would not steal victory. Whether those exact words were spoken cannot be confirmed, but his reasoning was practical. Night battles easily descended into confusion. His carefully trained formations depended upon coordination. He trusted his soldiers more than chance. Instead, he personally rode across the ground, examining every feature. He observed the Persian deployment. He noted the open plain. He considered where cavalry could move, where infantry might struggle, where opportunities might appear. Alexander rarely entered battle without understanding the terrain better than his opponents. That evening, many of his soldiers found sleep difficult. Campfires stretched across the plain. Some men sharpened weapons. Others repaired armor. Some prayed quietly. Others sat in silence, wondering whether dawn would be their last. Across the darkness, thousands of Persian fires glowed. The enemy seemed endless. Alexander, however, reportedly slept peacefully. When officers entered his tent before sunrise, they found him resting calmly. Whether this reflected complete confidence or simple exhaustion, no one could say. Either way, it affected morale. If the king feared nothing, perhaps his soldiers should fear nothing as well. Morning arrived. The two armies formed. The Persian line extended far beyond the Macedonian flanks. Darius occupied the center, standing in his magnificent royal chariot. Around him gathered elite guards and noble cavalry. Side chariots waited before the line. War elephants stood nearby. Every element of Persian military power had been assembled. Alexander arranged his own army with characteristic precision. The phalanx occupied the center. The companion cavalry assembled on the right under Alexander himself. Parmenion commanded the left. Behind the main line stood reserve formations, prepared to respond if Persian cavalry attempted encirclement. This detail revealed Alexander's foresight. He anticipated exactly the maneuver Darius hoped to achieve. The battle opened with movement rather than immediate collision. Alexander slowly advanced toward the right. Not directly forward, not straight toward Darius. Instead, he angled across the plain. At first, the maneuver puzzled observers. Gradually, the Persian line shifted to match him. Darius could not allow Alexander simply to ride around the flank. Persian cavalry followed. As they moved, gaps inevitably appeared between different units. Tiny spaces, barely noticeable. Alexander watched patiently. This was precisely what he wanted. Darius, believing he was preventing encirclement, unknowingly weakened the center of his own formation. Seeing the Macedonian movement, the Persian king launched his scythed chariots. Hundreds of horses thundered across the plain. The spinning blades attached to their wheels glittered beneath the morning sun. The psychological effect alone must have been terrifying. For many armies, such a charge would have shattered discipline. Alexander had prepared carefully. His light infantry moved forward first. Javelins flew toward the horses. Archers added arrows. Some chariots never reached the Macedonian line. Others continued despite wounded animals. Then the phalanx performed exactly as trained. Ranks opened. Lanes appeared between units. The surviving chariots raced harmlessly through those gaps. Soldiers standing behind them killed the drivers or captured the vehicles. Within minutes, Persia's terrifying new weapon had accomplished almost nothing. Again, discipline defeated spectacle. Now came Alexander's moment. The Persian line had stretched. The center had weakened. Without hesitation, the companion cavalry turned sharply. Trumpets sounded. Thousands of horsemen lowered their lances. Alexander rode at the front. The charge accelerated. Hooves pounded the earth. Dust rose behind them. The heavy cavalry crashed into the opening before the Persians could close it. The impact was devastating. The Macedonians punched through one layer after another. Elite guards fought desperately. Some succeeded in slowing the advance. None stopped it. Alexander drove relentlessly toward Darius himself. Elsewhere on the battlefield, events unfolded differently. The Macedonian left came under enormous pressure. Persian cavalry attacked repeatedly. Some units even broke through toward Alexander's baggage camp. Fierce fighting erupted far behind the main line. For a time, Parmenians struggled to hold. Messages urgently requested reinforcement. Yet at the center of everything, one fact dominated the battle. Alexander was approaching the great king. Darius watched the companion cavalry cutting through his guards. He had experienced this once before at Issus. Now it was happening again. He faced a terrible choice. Remain, risk capture or death, or flee. He chose flight. His chariot turned. The royal standard moved away from the battlefield. Persian soldiers saw it. The same psychological collapse that had occurred at Issus unfolded once more. Confidence vanished. Units still fighting bravely suddenly realized the king had departed. Confusion spread. Some continued resisting. Others began retreating. Retreat became panic. Panic became collapse. The greatest army Persia could assemble dissolved into chaos. Alexander wanted to pursue immediately. Capturing Darius would end the war. Then another message reached him. Parmenians' position remained under severe pressure. Persian cavalry threatened disaster on the Macedonian left. Alexander faced one of the hardest decisions of his career: continue pursuing Darius, or rescue his own army. He chose the latter. Turning away from the fleeing king, he rode to support Parmenion. By the time reinforcement arrived, the Persian collapse had already begun spreading across the battlefield. The danger passed, but Darius escaped. Again, it was one of the few moments in Alexander's career where victory remained incomplete. The great king still lived. The battle itself, however, had changed history. Gaugamela effectively destroyed Persian military power. No field army remained capable of stopping Alexander. The road to the imperial capitals now lay open. His first destination was Babylon. Few cities possessed greater historical significance. Babylon had already stood ancient when Greece itself remained a collection of small settlements. Its walls, its temples, its hanging gardens, if they truly existed as later described, its scholars, its astronomical observations, its immense cultural legacy. all made Babylon one of humanity's greatest cities. The gates opened peacefully. There would be no siege. Babylon welcomed its new ruler. Alexander entered not as a destroyer, but as a king. He respected local religious traditions. He sacrificed to Babylonian gods. He ordered restoration of temples neglected under previous administrations. Officials who surrendered willingly often retained their positions. Alexander increasingly presented himself not as conqueror, but as legitimate successor to Persian authority. From Babylon, he advanced to Susa. Once again, resistance proved minimal. Inside the royal treasury lay astonishing wealth. Ancient historians estimated tens of thousands of talents of gold and silver. The numbers are almost impossible to visualize. Modern calculations suggest many hundreds of tons of precious metal. This treasure represented generations of accumulated imperial taxation. Suddenly, it belonged to Alexander. The financial limitations that had constrained earlier campaigns largely disappeared. He could now pay soldiers for years, build cities, finance new expeditions, reward loyal officers. The conquest had become self-sustaining. Yet one destination remained above all others: Persepolis. Unlike Babylon, Persepolis served primarily as the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. It symbolized royal authority. Here kings celebrated important festivals. Here tribute from across the empire appeared in magnificent processions. Its palaces displayed extraordinary artistry. Stone reliefs showed representatives from many nations bringing gifts before the great king. Columns towered above broad terraces. The city proclaimed imperial grandeur. Alexander approached through difficult mountain country. Persian defenders attempted delaying actions. One narrow pass became known as the Persian Gates. Its geography resembled Thermopylae. Steep mountains restricted movement. Defenders held commanding positions. Initial attacks failed. Instead of repeating costly frontal assaults, Alexander searched for another path. Local guides revealed a mountain route leading behind the Persian defenses. Moving secretly through rugged terrain, Macedonian forces appeared unexpectedly in the defenders' rear. Caught between two attacks, the Persian position collapsed. Again, Alexander had solved the military problem through maneuver rather than brute force. In early 330 BCE, he entered Persepolis. The city yielded immense treasure. Its vaults surpassed even those of Susa. Ancient accounts describe thousands of animals carrying away gold and silver. The accumulated wealth of 2 centuries passed into Macedonian hands. Then came one of the most debated episodes of Alexander's entire life. The royal palace burned. Why? Ancient writers offered different explanations. Some claimed Alexander deliberately destroyed Persepolis as revenge for Xerxes burning Athens generations earlier. Others described a drunken banquet where an Athenian woman named Thais urged the king to avenge Greece by setting the palace ablaze. Another tradition suggests Alexander regretted the decision almost immediately. Modern historians continue debating the truth. Perhaps revenge played a role. Perhaps alcohol influenced judgment. Perhaps the destruction served as calculated political theater, signaling that the old Persian monarchy had ended forever. Whatever the motivation, the flames became symbolic. Columns cracked beneath intense heat. Magnificent halls collapsed. Smoke rose over the ceremonial capital of an empire that had ruled much of the known world. To Greeks, the fire represented vengeance. To Persians, it represented catastrophe. To history, it marked the irreversible end of Achaemenid supremacy. Yet the empire had not quite disappeared. Darius still lived. Alexander could not truly claim the Persian throne while its lawful ruler remained free. Therefore, the pursuit resumed. The fleeing king retreated eastward, across Media, toward the Iranian plateau, toward provinces still loyal to him. Alexander followed relentlessly. His marches became astonishingly fast. Soldiers covered extraordinary distances. The hope remained that Darius might finally be captured alive. Events unfolded differently. As Alexander drew nearer, confidence among Persian nobles collapsed. Many no longer believed Darius capable of saving the empire. One of the most powerful eastern governors, Bessus, decided to act. Along with other conspirators, he arrested the king. Perhaps they hoped to negotiate with Alexander. Perhaps they intended to proclaim a new ruler. Perhaps they simply sought survival. No source can reveal every motive with certainty. Then Alexander came closer. The conspirators panicked. Rather than allowing Darius to fall alive into Macedonian hands, they stabbed him and abandoned him beside the road before fleeing eastward. Not long afterward, Alexander's advance guard discovered the dying king. The scene became legendary. According to later tradition, Alexander covered Darius with his own cloak and expressed sorrow that a great king should meet such an end. Whether every detail happened exactly this way remains uncertain. The symbolism mattered. Alexander did not celebrate Darius's murder. He condemned it. Publicly, he portrayed himself as avenger rather than beneficiary. By punishing the king's assassins, he strengthened his own claim to inherit Persian authority. Darius died in the summer of 330 BCE. With him ended the Achaemenid dynasty that had ruled for more than 200 years. Alexander was only 26 years old. In scarcely 4 years, he had crossed into Asia, defeated every major Persian army, captured the empire's capitals, seized its treasury, and outlived the king who had once ruled lands stretching from Egypt to Central Asia. Most rulers would have considered the campaign complete. Alexander did not. The men responsible for Darius's death had escaped into the far eastern provinces. Beyond them lay territories many Greeks scarcely knew existed. Mountains, deserts, remote fortresses, peoples who had never accepted complete Persian control. Alexander intended to pursue them all. The world he believed remained unconquered still stretched beyond the horizon. And for a man whose ambition recognized almost no limits, turning back had never truly been an option. For many kings, the death of Darius would have marked the end of the campaign. The enemy ruler was gone. The imperial capitals had fallen. The treasury belonged to the victor. The greatest empire of the age had ceased to exist as an independent power. By every conventional measure, Alexander had already achieved the impossible. Yet conventional limits had never interested him. To Alexander, conquest remained incomplete as long as resistance survived anywhere within the lands that had once obeyed the Persian crown. The men who had betrayed Darius still lived. The eastern provinces had not fully submitted. Beyond them lay territories that Greek geographers described only imperfectly, lands where maps became uncertain and stories often replaced reliable knowledge. Alexander intended to go there. His officers understood what that meant. Every mile east carried them farther from Macedonia. Every new province lengthened supply lines. Every victory created additional territory that required garrisons. The army had already marched farther than any Greek force in history. Still, their king looked toward the horizon rather than home. The pursuit led first into Media, then beyond the familiar heartland of the old Persian Empire. Gradually, the landscape began changing. The broad plains gave way to rougher country. Mountain ranges dominated the distance. Dry valleys alternated with fertile river basins. Travel became slower. Weather became less predictable. The enemy also changed. The armies Alexander had defeated at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela fought as organized imperial forces. What awaited him now was entirely different. The eastern satrapies possessed powerful local rulers who understood the terrain intimately. They could disappear into mountains after striking unexpectedly. They relied less upon massive set-piece battles and more upon mobility, raids, and endurance. It was a style of warfare that frustrated even experienced commanders. Alexander soon found himself campaigning in Bactria. Today, that region includes parts of Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and neighboring territories. To the Greeks, it seemed unimaginably distant. To modern readers, it remains recognizable as some of the most difficult country on earth for military operations. Towering mountains divided valleys. Narrow passes restricted movement. Harsh winters alternated with scorching summers. Even supplying an army posed extraordinary challenges. The principal target remained Bessus. After helping murder Darius, Bessus had declared himself the new great king. He adopted the royal name Artaxerxes and attempted to rally eastern resistance. In theory, his claim possessed some legitimacy. He belonged to the Persian nobility. The western capitals had fallen, but the eastern provinces still remained beyond Alexander's direct control. If enough governors accepted him, the empire might continue under new leadership. Alexander refused to allow that possibility. The pursuit became relentless. Crossing the Hindu Kush tested both soldiers and animals to their limits. The mountain range rose far above anything most Macedonians had previously experienced. Snow lingered on high passes long after spring arrived elsewhere. Thin air exhausted men unused to such elevations. Pack animals slipped on icy trails. Food became scarce. Entire columns stretched for miles along narrow paths carved into mountainsides. More than once the expedition seemed to challenge nature itself rather than any human enemy. Yet the army continued. One quality repeatedly distinguished Alexander from many earlier commanders. He rarely demanded hardships from soldiers that he would not personally share. He marched beside them. He crossed rivers with them. He climbed mountains with them. His willingness to endure the same suffering inspired extraordinary loyalty, even among men who increasingly questioned where the campaign might finally end. Eventually, Bessus discovered that claiming the Persian throne proved easier than defending it. Many Eastern nobles recognized that Alexander would not abandon the pursuit. One after another, they reconsidered their loyalties. Support began dissolving. Finally, Bessus's own followers arrested him. Rather than dying in glorious resistance, the self-proclaimed king found himself handed over to the very enemy he had hoped to defeat. Alexander treated the case carefully. Bessus had not merely resisted him. He had murdered Darius. Publicly, Alexander declared that crime unacceptable. The former satrap was mutilated according to Persian custom for traitors and later executed. The punishment carried important symbolism. Alexander presented himself not as destroyer of the Persian monarchy, but as its lawful successor. He would avenge the murdered king. He would punish rebellion. He would uphold royal authority. These actions increasingly reflected a remarkable transformation. When Alexander first crossed into Asia, he described himself as leader of a Greek campaign against Persia. Now he increasingly behaved as king of Persia himself. Many Macedonians noticed. Not all approved. Although Bessus had fallen, peace did not follow. Instead, the campaign entered perhaps its most exhausting phase. The regions of Sogdiana and Bactria refused easy submission. Rather than assembling one great army, local leaders relied upon guerrilla tactics. Small mounted groups struck unexpectedly. Fortified mountain strongholds sheltered defenders beyond the reach of conventional assaults. Entire villages could disappear before Macedonian forces arrived. The war became one of patience. One fortress after another had to be reduced. One valley after another secured. One rebellion after another suppressed. This kind of warfare lacked the dramatic glory of Gaugamela. No single battle decided the outcome. Progress came slowly. Losses accumulated steadily. The soldiers grew tired. Some had not seen Macedonia for 6 years. Children left behind were becoming adults. Parents had died. Homes had changed. The world they remembered seemed increasingly distant. Alexander, however, remained convinced that unfinished work still lay ahead. One episode from these campaigns became especially famous. A mountain fortress known today as the Sogdian Rock appeared almost impossible to capture. Its cliffs rose nearly vertical. Supplies inside could sustain defenders for months. When Alexander demanded surrender, the defenders reportedly laughed. They declared that the Macedonians would need wings before they could reach the summit. Alexander accepted the challenge. He announced generous rewards for volunteers willing to climb the cliffs during the night. Several hundred experienced climbers stepped forward. Using iron pegs and ropes, they began ascending sheer rock faces that the defenders believed impassable. The climb proved deadly. Ancient accounts suggest dozens fell to their deaths. The survivors, however, reached the heights before dawn. At sunrise, they raised signals visible from below. Alexander pointed toward the figures standing above the fortress. Then he sent another message to the defenders. His soldiers, he observed, had apparently found wings after all. Whether every detail unfolded exactly this way cannot be proven. Ancient historians understandably appreciated dramatic stories. Still, the essential event appears historical. The psychological effect proved overwhelming. Seeing Macedonian soldiers occupying heights they believed inaccessible, the defenders surrendered. Again, Alexander demonstrated something beyond simple military strength. He repeatedly attacked confidence. Once opponents believed resistance impossible, battles often ended before prolonged bloodshed became necessary. Among those captured at the fortress was a young noblewoman named Roxanne. Ancient writers consistently describe her as exceptionally beautiful. More importantly, she belonged to an influential Bactrian family. Alexander married her. The marriage surprised many Macedonians. Kings certainly entered political marriages. That was nothing unusual. Yet this union represented more than diplomacy. By marrying into one of the leading families of Central Asia, Alexander signaled that he intended to rule these lands permanently rather than simply occupy them. He was no longer merely conquering Persia. He was becoming part of it. His policies increasingly reflected this broader vision. Persian nobles entered important positions. Local officials often remained in office if they accepted his authority. Eastern customs appeared more frequently at court. Gradually, Alexander adopted aspects of Persian royal dress and ceremony. He believed such changes necessary. Millions of his new subjects expected kings to behave in certain ways. If he wished to rule successfully, he needed to appear as legitimate monarch rather than foreign occupier. Many Macedonians disagreed. To them, Persian clothing symbolized the defeated enemy. Persian court rituals seemed excessive. Some traditions, especially proskynesis, deeply offended Greek ideas about freedom. In Persian culture, bowing before the king reflected respect. Among Greeks, such gestures belonged properly only to the gods. The cultural divide widened. Alexander hoped to bridge it. His oldest companions often resisted. Unfortunately, these political disagreements coincided with changes in Alexander himself. Years of uninterrupted success had transformed him. No army had defeated him. No rival remained capable of matching his power. Every command became law. Every victory reinforced belief in his exceptional destiny. At the same time, constant campaigning imposed tremendous psychological strain. He had witnessed countless deaths. He carried wounds from numerous battles. Responsibility for an empire stretching thousands of miles rested upon his shoulders. Alcohol increasingly accompanied royal banquets. Ancient sources repeatedly mention heavy drinking. Whether these accounts exaggerate remains uncertain, but enough independent writers describe similar behavior that historians generally accept it played an important role during Alexander's later years. One evening tragedy struck. During a banquet, conversation turned toward military achievements. Some praised Alexander above Philip. Others celebrated recent victories. Among those present sat Clitus the Black. Years earlier, at the Granicus River, Clitus had saved Alexander's life by cutting down the Persian noble who nearly killed him. He was no ordinary officer. He was one of the king's oldest companions. As wine flowed, the discussion grew heated. Clitus argued that Alexander owed much of his success to Philip's preparations. The army, the tactics, the reforms. None had appeared by magic. Others defended Alexander. The argument intensified. Ancient historians differ over the precise words exchanged. All agree on the ending. Consumed by anger, Alexander seized a spear. Before anyone could stop him, he drove it into Clitus. The man who had once saved his life died before him. Silence followed. Almost immediately, Alexander realized what he had done. His rage disappeared. Only horror remained. According to several accounts, he attempted to kill himself in despair and had to be restrained by companions. For days he refused food. He wept continuously. The grief appears genuine. Yet remorse could not undo the act. Clitus remained dead. The episode marked a turning point. Those around Alexander now understood that criticism, especially during moments of anger, could prove fatal. Fear entered relationships that had once rested upon friendship. Not long afterward, another controversy deepened the divide. Callisthenes, nephew of Aristotle and official historian of the expedition, opposed the introduction of proskynesis among the Macedonians. He argued that free Greeks should never bow before another man. Alexander regarded resistance as political obstruction. When a conspiracy involving several young royal pages later emerged, Callisthenes became implicated. Whether he actually participated remains uncertain. Many historians suspect the accusations were exaggerated or even fabricated. Regardless, he died in captivity. His death shocked the Greek intellectual world. The student once taught by Aristotle had now eliminated Aristotle's own relative. These events reveal the complexity of Alexander's later personality. He remained brilliant, energetic, capable of astonishing achievements. Yet increasing power seemed accompanied by growing suspicion and emotional volatility. The qualities that had helped him conquer an empire did not necessarily help him govern one. Still, the Eastern campaigns gradually succeeded. One rebellion after another ended. New cities were founded. Garrisons secured strategic routes. Trade networks expanded. Greek settlers mixed with local populations. For the first time in history, regions stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia belonged to one political system. The scale alone remains remarkable. Travelers could now move across enormous distances under a single ruler's authority. Ideas, goods, languages, religions, scientific knowledge, all would circulate more freely because of these conquests. By 327 BCE, the northeastern frontier appeared largely secure. Most kings would finally have returned west. Alexander instead looked even farther east. Beyond the Indus River lay India. To Greeks, it represented almost the edge of the known world. Stories described immense wealth, exotic animals, powerful kingdoms, philosophers living lives of remarkable simplicity, great rivers wider than any in the Mediterranean. Alexander wanted to see those lands himself. Perhaps he also believed that reaching the Eastern Ocean would complete his conquest of Asia. His soldiers reacted differently. They had marched thousands of miles, fought dozens of battles, crossed deserts, climbed mountains. Many quietly hoped the campaign had finally ended. Instead, preparations began for another invasion. The greatest journey of Alexander's life was about to enter its final chapter, and ahead waited enemies unlike any he had yet encountered, including the animals that would challenge even the famous Macedonian phalanx in ways no previous battlefield ever had. When Alexander led his army toward the Indian subcontinent in 327 BCE, he was not entering an unknown wilderness. The lands beyond the Hindu Kush were home to ancient kingdoms with long-established traditions, thriving cities, sophisticated political systems, and rulers who had no intention of surrendering simply because another conqueror had arrived from the west. To the Greeks, however, India occupied an almost mythical place. Travelers returned with stories of immense rivers that seemed more like inland seas than waterways. They described forests unlike anything found around the Mediterranean. They spoke of strange animals that dwarfed horses, of spices, precious stones, exotic plants, wise philosophers who rejected wealth, and kings whose armies included creatures that many Macedonians had only heard about in stories. Elephants. Alexander crossed the Hindu Kush once again, descending into the valleys that today form parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. His advance followed routes already known through centuries of trade. Some local rulers welcomed him. Others resisted. As throughout the Persian campaign, diplomacy often proved as important as battle. A ruler who submitted peacefully usually retained authority under Macedonian supervision. A ruler who resisted faced war. One of the earliest strongholds to oppose Alexander occupied a steep mountain known by the Greeks as Aornos. Ancient writers claimed that even Heracles had failed to capture it. Whether that tradition reflected local legend or later embellishment is impossible to determine. What mattered to Alexander was its reputation. If generations believed the fortress unconquerable, taking it would carry enormous symbolic weight. The defenders relied upon geography. The mountain rose sharply above the surrounding landscape. Natural cliffs protected much of its perimeter. Approaching armies could be seen long before they reached the summit. Alexander responded with characteristic determination. His engineers constructed earthworks that gradually extended toward the heights. Archers and light infantry protected the workers. Bit by bit, the distance narrowed. Eventually, Macedonian troops reached positions from which direct assaults became possible. After fierce fighting, the fortress fell. Whether or not Heracles had ever attempted such a conquest, Alexander had achieved another victory that reinforced his growing legend. Every difficult obstacle seemed only to strengthen his confidence. As the campaign continued, he entered the Punjab, a region divided among several kingdoms. Some rulers calculated that cooperation offered the safest path. Others chose resistance. Among them stood the man history remembers as King Porus. Unlike many earlier opponents, Porus neither fled nor negotiated from weakness. He prepared for battle. His kingdom lay beyond the Hydaspes River, known today as the Jalem. When Alexander arrived, he found the river swollen by seasonal rains. Its current ran swift and deep. Crossing in front of a waiting enemy would be extraordinarily dangerous. On the opposite bank, Porus positioned his army carefully. His cavalry waited behind the shoreline. Infantry formed supporting lines. Most intimidating of all stood approximately 200 war elephants. The Macedonians had encountered elephants before during the Persian campaigns, but never in such numbers and never as the central element of an opposing army. For horses unfamiliar with the enormous animals, the sight alone could trigger panic. The smell, the noise, the sheer size, everything about them represented a new challenge. Alexander refused to rush. Instead, he turned once again to deception. For days his army marched up and down the riverbank. Sometimes they prepared boats. Sometimes cavalry assembled as though ready to cross. Each movement forced Porus to respond. Again and again, the Indian king shifted troops to meet apparent threats. Again and again, no crossing occurred. Gradually, the defenders grew accustomed to these demonstrations. They remained alert, but constant readiness exhausted both men and animals. Then came a violent storm. Thunder rolled across the valley. Heavy rain reduced visibility. Under cover of darkness and bad weather, Alexander quietly selected a force of infantry and cavalry. Moving many miles upstream, they found an island and a narrower section of the river. There, before dawn, the crossing began. Conditions remained difficult. Strong currents separated units. Some soldiers landed farther downstream than intended. Others struggled against mud and flooded ground. Even so, by the sunrise, a substantial Macedonian force stood on the eastern bank. Porus reacted quickly. Believing this to be only a diversion, he first sent part of his army under the command of one of his sons. The resulting engagement ended in Macedonian victory. Only then did Porus recognize that Alexander himself had crossed. He moved his main army to meet him. The battlefield differed greatly from Gaugamela. Rain had softened the earth. Movement became difficult. The elephants stood at intervals across the Indian line. Behind them waited infantry. Cavalry occupied the wings. Alexander deployed his own cavalry aggressively. He sought to draw the Indian horsemen away from the elephants. Repeated attacks and counterattacks swept across the plain. Dust mixed with rain. Visibility changed constantly. At the center, the elephants advanced. No description can fully capture the psychological impact they must have produced. Each animal towered above nearby soldiers. Some carried archers. Others supported armored warriors. Their trunks seized men. Their tusks, often fitted with blades or protective armor, became deadly weapons. Where elephants entered the Macedonian ranks, formations bent under enormous pressure. Yet discipline again proved decisive. Alexander's infantry did not collapse. They adjusted. Instead of concentrating solely upon the riders, many attacked the elephants themselves. Javelins struck vulnerable areas. Spears targeted trunks and eyes whenever possible. As wounds accumulated, several elephants became uncontrollable. In pain and confusion, they turned back into their own lines. What had begun as an advantage gradually became chaos for parts of Porus's army. The battle lasted for hours. It proved among the hardest fought of Alexander's career. Eventually, the Indian formations began breaking apart. Porus himself continued fighting from the back of his elephant until surrounded. Captured but unbowed, he was brought before Alexander. Ancient historians preserve one of the most famous conversations of the campaign. Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. Porus answered simply, like a king. Alexander reportedly smiled. And for anything else? Everything is contained in those words. Whether the dialogue survives exactly as spoken is impossible to know. Ancient biographers appreciated memorable exchanges. Even so, the outcome reflects historical reality. Alexander admired Porus. Instead of stripping him of power, he restored his kingdom. He even granted him additional territory. It was a practical decision. A respected local ruler governing in Alexander's name offered greater stability than direct military occupation. The victory at the Hydaspes represented one of Alexander's greatest tactical achievements. It also carried personal sorrow. Not long afterward, his famous horse, Bucephalus, died. The exact cause remains uncertain. Some ancient writers attribute his death to wounds received during the campaign. Others believe simple age ended the life of the animal. Bucephalus had carried Alexander through years of warfare. From the plains of Greece to the mountains of Central Asia, horse and rider had become inseparable. Alexander founded a city in his companion's honor, Bucephala. The gesture revealed something deeply personal beneath the conqueror's public image. Despite commanding empires, he still mourned the loss of the horse that had accompanied him for much of his life. Yet even after such a difficult campaign, Alexander looked farther east. Reports reached him of larger kingdoms beyond the Ganges. Some accounts described armies possessing thousands of elephants. Whether those numbers reflected reality hardly mattered. Alexander wanted to continue. His soldiers did not. For nearly 8 years, they had marched almost without interruption. They had crossed deserts where water scarcely existed, scaled mountain passes buried beneath snow, stormed fortified cities, won battles against armies larger than their own. Many carried scars from numerous wounds. Some had buried lifelong friends along roads stretching thousands of miles. Home had become a distant memory. When the army reached the Hyphasis River, today known as the Bios, Alexander prepared to cross once more. Instead, he encountered something he had never faced before: refusal. The soldiers did not attack their king. They did not shout. They did not threaten rebellion with violence. They simply declined to continue. Ancient sources describe silence spreading through the assembled ranks. When Alexander called councils, few responded. Finally, one of his senior officers, Caenus, spoke openly. He reminded the king of everything the army had already endured. Many veterans longed to see their families again. New generations had grown up in Macedonia without fathers. The men remained loyal, but they had reached their limit. The speech required extraordinary courage. Addressing an absolute monarch in such direct terms carried obvious risks. Alexander listened. He remained unconvinced. For several days, he withdrew into his tent. Perhaps he hoped the army would reconsider. Perhaps he struggled privately with the realization that determination alone could not overcome every obstacle. Eventually, he ordered sacrifices to determine the god's will. The omens, according to official announcements, proved unfavorable. Alexander declared that the campaign would turn back. Whether the sacrifices genuinely influenced him or merely provided an honorable explanation remains impossible to determine. The practical reality was unmistakable. For the first time in his career, Alexander had not achieved what he wanted. He had not been defeated by an enemy army. He had been stopped by the exhaustion of his own soldiers. Before leaving, he ordered enormous altars constructed beside the river. They commemorated the easternmost point reached by the Macedonian expedition. Then the long journey home began. Rather than retracing the same route immediately, Alexander chose to explore the Indus River system. Part of the army traveled aboard newly built ships. Others marched along the banks. The expedition combined military operations with geographic exploration. Greek knowledge of the region expanded dramatically. Not every encounter proved peaceful. Several tribes resisted fiercely. During the assault on one fortified settlement, Alexander once again demonstrated the recklessness that had become almost habitual. Impatient with the pace of the attack, he climbed a scaling ladder himself. A handful of soldiers followed. The ladder broke beneath the weight of men climbing behind them. Suddenly, Alexander found himself isolated inside the enemy position. Defenders surrounded him. An arrow pierced his armor and struck deep into his chest. Ancient sources suggest the missile penetrated a lung. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that the greatest conqueror of the age might die in an obscure fortress thousands of miles from home. His companions fought desperately to reach him. The struggle became frantic. Eventually they succeeded. Alexander, bleeding heavily, was carried from the battlefield. The wound nearly killed him. Rumors of his death spread rapidly through the army. When he recovered sufficiently to appear before his soldiers, many reportedly wept with relief. They had followed him across continents. Whatever frustrations they felt, their loyalty to him remained profound. Recovery took time. Even after the wound healed, it almost certainly weakened him. Modern historians often point to this injury among several factors that may have contributed to his declining health during the final years of his life. Once the expedition reached the lower Indus, Alexander divided his forces. Part of the army, accompanied by a fleet under the command of Nearchus, would explore the coastline and eventually sail toward the Persian Gulf. Alexander himself chose a different route. He would lead another force across the Gaugamela Desert. Today, much of that region lies within southern Iran and Pakistan. The decision remains one of the most controversial of his career. Ancient writers themselves questioned it. Some suggested Alexander wished to surpass earlier rulers who had failed to cross the desert. Others believed he wanted to support Nearchus's coastal voyage. Whatever his reasoning, the consequences proved severe. The Gaugamela Desert offered almost no mercy. Water sources lay far apart. Heat became overwhelming. Sandstorms reduced visibility. Pack animals collapsed. Supplies disappeared. Entire groups lost contact with one another. Thousands died from thirst, exhaustion, and exposure. The crossing inflicted heavier losses than many battles. Alexander shared the hardships. One famous story tells of soldiers finding a small quantity of water and bringing it to the king in a helmet. Seeing that there was not enough for everyone, Alexander poured it onto the ground rather than drink while his men remained thirsty. Whether literally true or not, the story survived because it reflected something his soldiers believed about him. He expected much from them. He also expected much from himself. By the time the survivors emerged from the desert and reunited with Nearchus's fleet, the great campaign had entered its final phase. Alexander had marched farther east than any Greek commander before him. He had defeated the Persian Empire, crossed the Hindu Kush, reached India, explored lands that had previously existed only in rumor for many in the Mediterranean world. Yet the years of constant conquest had changed both the empire and the man who ruled it. Ahead lay an even more difficult challenge than winning battles. He now had to govern the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, and that task would test him in ways that no battlefield ever had. When Alexander returned from the eastern campaigns, he was no longer simply the king of Macedonia or the conqueror of Persia. He ruled an empire that stretched from the mountains of Greece to the fringes of India, from the deserts of Egypt to the rivers of Central Asia. No ruler in history had ever governed such a continuous territory. The triumph was undeniable. The challenge that followed would prove even greater. Winning an empire and governing an empire were very different tasks. Alexander quickly discovered that while battles could be decided in a single day, building a stable state required patience, compromise, and institutions that could survive beyond one man's presence. During the years he had spent campaigning, many officials left behind in positions of authority had begun acting as though they were independent rulers. Some enriched themselves through corruption. Others mistreated local populations. A few even raised private military forces, assuming Alexander would never return from the distant east. His response was immediate. Investigations were ordered. Officials found guilty of serious abuses were removed. Several were executed. The message was unmistakable. No governor ruled in his own name. All authority ultimately flowed from the king. Yet punishment alone could not solve the larger question. How could one ruler govern peoples who spoke different languages, worshiped different gods, followed different customs, and possessed centuries of separate history? Alexander's answer differed from that of many conquerors before him. Instead of attempting to erase local traditions, he increasingly sought to combine them with Greek institutions. He retained many Persian administrators because they understood how the empire functioned. He continued using existing systems of taxation. He respected local religious practices. Temples across the empire often received gifts and protection rather than destruction. Where earlier conquerors sometimes imposed complete cultural replacement, Alexander increasingly experimented with coexistence. This policy, however, created tension among his own followers. Many Macedonians believed they had conquered Asia through years of sacrifice. They expected privileged status. Instead, they watched Persian nobles receive important positions. They saw Eastern customs entering the royal court. Some began wondering whether their king was becoming more Persian than Macedonian. Alexander himself had changed. Years spent ruling millions of Persian subjects naturally influenced his understanding of kingship. Persian monarchs appeared before their courts with elaborate ceremony. Royal clothing differed from Greek styles. Court etiquette emphasized the almost sacred status of the king. Alexander adopted some of these practices. To him, they represented practical politics. To many of his companions, they seemed dangerous departures from Macedonian tradition. The disagreement reached beyond clothing. Alexander believed the empire would survive only if Greeks and Persians learned to govern together. His vision reached its clearest expression in the city of Susa during 324 BCE. There he organized one of the most extraordinary ceremonies of the ancient world, a mass wedding. Alexander himself married Statura, a daughter of Darius III. At the same ceremony, dozens of senior Macedonian officers married Persian noblewomen. The event symbolized far more than personal relationships. It represented an attempt to unite ruling families from both cultures into a single political elite. Whether motivated primarily by idealism or practical statecraft, the policy revealed Alexander's long-term ambitions. He did not imagine an empire permanently divided between conquerors and conquered. He imagined something new. Reality proved more complicated. Many of these marriages ended shortly after Alexander's death. Some officers abandoned their Persian wives almost immediately. Centuries of cultural difference could not disappear through one ceremony. Still, the attempt itself reflected Alexander's willingness to think beyond traditional boundaries. He also ordered the training of thousands of Persian youths in Macedonian military methods. These young men learned the use of the sarissa. They drilled according to Macedonian discipline. They represented the beginning of an army that might one day combine Eastern manpower with Western military organization. Again, many Macedonians viewed the development with suspicion. Some feared they were being replaced. Those fears erupted during an assembly at Opus. Alexander announced that older Macedonian veterans would be allowed to return home with generous rewards. Instead of expressing gratitude, many soldiers reacted with anger. They believed the king intended to dismiss them while promoting Persians into their place. For men who had followed him from Europe to India, the idea felt like betrayal. The situation became dangerously emotional. Alexander responded with characteristic intensity. He reportedly dismissed the protesting soldiers and declared that if they wished to leave, they could all go. He would continue ruling with the support of his Asian subjects. The statement shocked the army. Silence followed. Gradually, the soldiers realized the depth of the crisis. Delegations approached, seeking forgiveness. Reconciliation followed. Alexander embraced many of the veterans publicly. A vast banquet celebrated the restored unity of the army. Representatives of numerous peoples gathered together. Greeks, Macedonians, Persians, Medes, Babylonians, and many others. The feast symbolized Alexander's hope that the empire could become something greater than a collection of conquered provinces. Whether that vision could ever have succeeded remains one of history's unanswered questions. Even as he attempted to strengthen the empire, Alexander's ambitions showed no sign of ending. New expeditions occupied his thoughts. Arabia attracted particular interest. Its trade routes promised enormous wealth. Its coastline remained poorly known to Greek geographers. Exploration fleets received orders. Engineers prepared equipment. Officials organized supplies. Some ancient writers even suggest Alexander envisioned later campaigns beyond Arabia, perhaps toward North Africa or farther west. At only 32 years of age, he still planned as though decades remained before him. His body, however, carried the weight of years of relentless campaigning. Scars marked him from numerous battles. The arrow wounds suffered in India had been severe. Repeated illnesses weakened him. Many ancient accounts also describe heavy drinking during his later years. Whether these reports are exaggerated cannot be known with certainty, but they appear frequently enough across independent traditions to suggest that alcohol played a significant role in court life. In the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander established himself in Babylon. The city stood near the center of his empire. Its location made it a logical base for future operations. Envoys arrived from distant regions. Greek states sent representatives. Officials from across Asia came to receive instructions. Construction projects continued. Military plans expanded. Everything suggested the beginning of another chapter. Then came the illness. Ancient sources differ in their details. Some describe a banquet followed by sudden fever. Others suggest symptoms developed more gradually. Over the following days, his condition worsened. The fever intensified. Weakness spread through his body. Despite the illness, Alexander reportedly continued discussing military matters for several days before becoming too weak to lead. As news spread through the camp, anxiety grew. No one could imagine the empire without him. His companions gathered. Soldiers crowded outside the palace. Rumors multiplied. Had he been poisoned? Had an old wound reopened? Was this malaria? Typhoid fever? Another infectious disease? More than 2,000 years later, historians still debate the cause. Most modern scholars consider disease more likely than assassination. The available evidence, however, does not permit absolute certainty. During the final days, Alexander gradually lost the ability to speak. Ancient writers describe his soldiers being allowed to file quietly past his bed. Many had marched beside him for over a decade. They had crossed rivers together, shared victories, endured hunger, faced death countless times. Now they watched the man who had led them farther than anyone believed possible lying silent before them. On either the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BCE, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. His reign had lasted only 13 years. In that brief span, he had transformed the political map of the ancient world more dramatically than almost any ruler before or since. His death immediately created the question everyone had hoped to avoid. Who would inherit the empire? The answer was not obvious. Alexander's half-brother Aristeus suffered from significant disabilities that limited his ability to rule independently. His wife Roxanne was pregnant, but the child had not yet been born. There was no mature heir capable of taking immediate control. According to one famous tradition, when asked to whom he left the empire, Alexander answered, "To the strongest." Whether he actually spoke those words remains uncertain. The phrase appears in later sources and may represent literary invention. Its meaning, however, proved prophetic. His generals attempted at first to preserve unity. Arrangements were made for joint kingship. Regents would govern until Alexander's unborn child came of age. On paper, the empire survived. In reality, ambition soon overwhelmed compromise. The men who had conquered the world together now fought one another. Historians know these conflicts as the wars of the successors. Ptolemy secured Egypt. Seleucus gradually established control over much of the Eastern Empire. Antigonus sought to reunify Alexander's territories under his own authority. Cassander dominated Macedonia. Lysimachus ruled Thrace. Alliances shifted repeatedly. Battles followed battles. Decades passed before relatively stable kingdoms emerged. Alexander's political empire disappeared astonishingly quickly. His cultural legacy did not. The kingdoms established by his successors became centers of what historians call the Hellenistic world. Greek language spread farther than ever before. Greek cities appeared across the Near East. Trade expanded. Ideas traveled alongside merchants and diplomats. Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest intellectual center of the ancient Mediterranean. Its famous library sought to gather every book known to the ancient world. Its scholars measured the earth with remarkable accuracy, studied medicine, advanced mathematics, cataloged literature, developed astronomy. The blending of Greek and Eastern traditions produced remarkable achievements. Philosophy evolved. New schools such as Stoicism and Epicureanism emerged. Scientific inquiry flourished. Art embraced greater realism and emotional expression. Architecture reflected influences from multiple cultures. The world Alexander created politically may have fragmented. The cultural connections he helped establish endured for centuries. Even Rome, which eventually conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms, inherited much from them. Roman elites learned Greek. Greek philosophy shaped Roman education. Greek remained the principal language across much of the Eastern Mediterranean long after Alexander's empire had vanished. When Christianity began spreading through the Roman world, it did so largely in Greek. The New Testament itself was written in that language. Indirectly, Alexander's conquests had helped create the cultural environment in which later civilizations would develop. His reputation also grew beyond history into legend. Stories multiplied. Some described him descending beneath the sea inside a glass vessel. Others imagined him rising into the heavens carried by giant birds. Medieval writers transformed him into a model king. Persian poets incorporated him into their own national traditions. Islamic literature remembered him in new ways. European romances celebrated him alongside legendary heroes. Every culture reshaped Alexander according to its own values. Modern historical scholarship has attempted to distinguish legend from evidence. Archaeology, ancient inscriptions, coins, contemporary documents, careful comparison of surviving sources. Together, they reveal a figure neither as flawless as ancient admirers claimed, nor as simple as later critics sometimes suggest. Alexander possessed extraordinary military ability. That much is difficult to dispute. He repeatedly defeated larger armies. He mastered logistics across enormous distances. He adapted tactics to different enemies and environments. He inspired remarkable loyalty. He accepted personal risk that few commanders would willingly face. At the same time, he could be ruthless. Cities that resisted him sometimes suffered devastating consequences. Thousands died during sieges. His ambitions demanded enormous human cost. Power appears to have changed aspects of his personality. Friends became victims of his anger. Criticism grew increasingly dangerous around him. Like many individuals granted nearly unlimited authority, he became more isolated from disagreement as the years passed. History therefore resists simple judgments. Was Alexander a visionary? In many respects, yes. He imagined connections between cultures that few rulers of his age considered possible. Was he a conqueror whose campaigns brought destruction? Undeniably. His victories came through war. Entire communities paid terrible prices. Was his legacy beneficial or harmful? The answer depends upon which consequences one chooses to emphasize. His empire collapsed. His cultural influence endured. His armies devastated cities. His foundations supported centuries of intellectual exchange. His story contains both creation and destruction. Perhaps that complexity explains why he continues to fascinate people more than 23 centuries after his death. Very few individuals alter the course of history on such a scale. Fewer still continue inspiring debate across generations. Alexander belongs to that rare group. His achievements remain astonishing. His failures remain instructive. His ambitions remind us how far determination can carry a human being. His mistakes remind us that even extraordinary ability cannot free anyone from the consequences of power, pride, or mortality. Well, he crossed the Hellespont as a young king. Few could have imagined the world that would emerge from his campaign. When he died in Babylon, the empire he created stood without the one person capable of holding it together. The political structure vanished. The cultural transformation remained. Today, cities bearing his name still exist. Ruins of the places he conquered continue to reveal new discoveries beneath the soil. Historians still analyze his battles. Military academies still study his campaigns. Archaeologists continue uncovering evidence from lands he once crossed. His life has become part of the shared story of human civilization. Alexander of Macedon began as the son of a king in a frontier kingdom many Greeks dismissed as uncivilized. He became the ruler of the largest empire the ancient world had yet seen. He died before reaching old age. His empire fragmented. His influence did not. The man passed into history. The legends spread across continents. And the questions raised by his life about ambition, leadership, conquest, cultural exchange, and the price of greatness continue to invite reflection long after the armies have disappeared and the battlefields have fallen silent. The journey ends here. The legacy does not.